Hey there everyone, it's your boy the 8-Bit Academic, and once again I am here to give you a small glimpse into the past with regards to both video games and today's topic. But before we jump into the history of one of the greatest technological inventions of all time, let's first take a look at today's video game feature, an obscure little gem from the mid-90s called Hover. A story that I have definitely told more than once on this channel, I think, is that of my younger self being exposed to the technological marvel that is the modern computer system at the tender young age of 7, an event which I still question to this day as to whether it was a good idea or not, since it made me develop interests that in my adult life seem to not have served me very well, since I am now a struggling artist with constant bouts of depression that often chooses escapism and regular dopamine hits through virtual entertainment because it's so much more easier than accomplishing anything meaningful in life that requires too much effort. Oh, how the snake eats its own tail.
Climb!
Hey, what's going on?
Anyway, thanks to my now late father, needing to get with the times due to his work, he decided to invest a pretty penny in the year 1997 on a Microsoft Windows 95 personal home computer, which had a whole 55 megabytes of hard drive space. Man, that sure was impressive, at least for the time. Back in the golden age of humanity, which was the 1990s, personal home computers would often come with a handful of CD-ROM discs, which would contain various digital catalogs that featured software and playable demos of video games that my young self would spend hours playing, because by this point, Lego blocks and Power Rangers action figures had become too boring. One such disc, called the Windows 95 CD Sampler, not to be mistaken with the Windows 95 Game Sampler, contained a whole free-to-play game called Hover, which at the time blew my freaking mind. But now, next to Warhammer 40k, I see it as the greatest piece of media that the human species has ever conceived.
And I gotta tell you, it was perfect. Perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
Hover was a simple 3D capture the flag style game, wherein you play as a red hovering bumper car, which has to navigate a series of 3 mazes and collect a bunch of blue flags before the opposing blue hovering bumper car can collect your red flags. After you complete all 3 mazes, the game simply recycles those same mazes again and slightly increases the difficulty by adding more flags to collect and more enemy bumper cars to avoid. The concept was so revolutionary and unique at the time that nothing has been able to top it since then. Not even this year's release of Assassin's Creed Shadows. I mean, black samurai and lesbian ninja ladies are cool and all, but can you do this? I didn't think so. The whole point behind this totally awesome game of all games was Bill Gates' attempt at showing off just how cool and slick the Microsoft Windows 95 operating system was, and all the advanced multimedia capabilities it had when compared to trash like Apple's Macintosh computers. Your 1998 iMac G3 had a semi-see-through box screen, did it? Well, could it do this? Because Microsoft are a bunch of chads, and I'm totally not shilling for them, they made it so that the greatest game of all time can even run on modern operating systems, with them having re-released Hover in 2013 as a browser game for Internet Explorer, which ended up having an 8-player multiplayer mode as well.
Stop! My penis can only get so erect.
It was also available on the Windows Store for a time, but sadly got removed. But fear not, me lads, ye can experience the full glory of this here game by visiting websites like myabandonware.com, and it still runs extremely smoothly on Windows 10 and 11, with no need for human sacrifices to get it to work properly. Anyway, while you sit there quietly like a good little audience member, enjoying the amazing visuals, graphics and gameplay of the greatest game of all time, I will now proceed to forcefully educate you about today's topic, the Internet. To start off, here's a brief explainer video that details exactly how the Internet works, to help all of you better understand this extremely complex topic.
This is the Internet. But how is it made? Well, it all starts here, in Australia, where it's mined before being transported using a special internet wheelbarrow to a factory for mixing. Smells delicious. Next, the internet is barreled up and rolled to the factory next door, where any bad internet is washed away, before the factory calls the head of the internet, Mr. Bill Gates, for his approval. Once approved, Thomas here releases a clean internet to begin its 10-month journey to Ireland.
Now that you have a fairly good understanding of how the internet works, let us continue. In modern times, you would be hard-pressed to find someone who has not heard of, or at least in some capacity hasn't used the internet. Even in highly remote areas of the Amazon jungle, you can find primitive tribesmen with severe porn addictions thanks to the internet. This is how you know that we are definitely living in the end times. But all jokes aside, one cannot deny just how much of an impact the internet has had on human society, and is near impossible to now go about one's day without connecting to the World Wide Web in one way or another, whether it be to chat to some friends on various chat apps like Messenger or WhatsApp, send them emails, track your business's progress on certain projects, create posts of your dumb political opinions, pretend to be an activist by supporting the current thing to fish for likes and attention, stream multiple forms of entertainment like music or films or obtain them illegally, hack into people's bank accounts and steal all their money, waste hours of your day by scrolling through a never-ending sea of brain rot, play video games or simply to look at pictures of naked ladies or questionable art, the fact remains that the technology we now know as the internet has come to dominate our very lives with just how addictive, integrated it has become, especially since the invention of the smartphone and wireless fidelity, or Wi-Fi. Believe it or not, however, this didn't always exist, and there was indeed a time when people still drove cars, flew in airplanes, and even played video games and had cellular phones, but had no access to this questionable invention called the internet. Just for a brief summary, the internet is a global system of interconnected computer networks that uses the Internet Protocol Suite, aka TCP/IP, to communicate between networks and devices. The Internet Protocol Suite being a framework for organizing the set of communication protocols used in computer networks. It is a network of networks that consists of private, public, academic, business and government networks of local to global scope, linked by a broad array of electronic, wireless, and optical networking technologies. The internet carries a vast range of information, resources, and services, such as the Intellect Hypertext documents and applications of the World Wide Web, or WWW, electronic email, internet telephony, and file sharing. Now that we have that ever so basic and confusing explanation out of the way, let's go back in time to the 1960s, the decade that birthed the internet. While yes, at least in terms of public and civilian use, the internet had not existed yet, since it only became available for the rest of humanity that didn't work for some secret 3-letter government agency in the year 1993, with it only becoming fully commercially available in countries outside the United States around the mid to late 90s depending on global region. In my country of South Africa, for example, while Rhodes University was the first institution that received internet in 1988 and service providers started popping up in 1993, it was only in 1995 when the internet became fully commercialized and accessible for the general public at the time, thanks to evil South African corporate devil worshippers like Telkom, MTN, Vodacom and Cell C. If you're South African, you'll understand where the resentment comes from. Seriously, all of them for reasons that I think the entire country can relate to. Anyway, as stated earlier, research and development of what would eventually become the internet started somewhere around the year 1965, or a little earlier. By this time, electronic analog computers were already a thing, albeit quite limited and rudimentary compared to today, being built upon the foundations of radio, radar, and other electronic technologies that were used during World War II, such as the torpedo data computer, developed by the US Navy in 1938, that used mathematical systems like trigonometry to allow a submarine to fire a torpedo at a moving target. However, concepts for the modern computer and computational systems actually date back all the way to the 1800s, but that is a topic for another video. American psychologist and computer scientist J.C.R. Licklider proposed the idea of a universal network while working at US-based research and development company Bolt, Baranek and Newman. He would later on end up leading the Information Processing Techniques Office, or IPTO, at the Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA, which is part of the United States Department of Defense. The whole idea behind this new research was to come up with a way for government agencies and the military to covertly share information and research with one another in a more resilient manner in the face of potential disruptions, especially those caused by a nuclear attack, according to a rumor that has been circulating since then. After all, this was during the half a century-long Cold War between NATO and the Soviet Union. However, as the project and research expanded over time and the technology improved as it was being developed, it was then realized that the potential uses for it were far greater than initially anticipated. If only they knew the kind of degeneracy it would lead to in the 21st century.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
Research into packet switching, which is a method of grouping data into short messages in fixed format known as packets and are transmitted over a digital network, started in the work of Paul Baran while he was employed at RAND Corporation, an American research institute and think tank in the 1960s. Computer scientist Donald Davies at the United Kingdom's National Physical Laboratory, or NPL, was also involved in early internet development and research in 1965, having created their own independent local area computer network in London that pioneered the concept of packet switching. It was this concept that inspired Paul Baran and led him to propose its use in the US networks that were being developed at the time. After the Symposium on Operating Systems Principles Conference in 1967, packet switching from the proposed NPL network and routing concepts put forward by Paul Baran after his exchanges with researchers in London were incorporated into the design of ARPANET, an experimental resource sharing network proposed by the aforementioned Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA. ARPANET was essentially the experimental computer networking system that would eventually become the forerunner of the internet as we have it today. As mentioned earlier, much of the desire to invent a technology that allowed the sharing of information without the need to transfer said information to physical devices like the magnetic computer tapes of the 1950s came out of the growing tensions between the US and Soviet Union during the Cold War. Many computers at the time were these massive blocks of electronics that were difficult to move around and would require an individual to either go to a site that housed these gigantic hard drives to obtain information or have the information copied to magnetic computer tapes, as mentioned before, similar to how CD-ROMs, floppy disks, and eventually USB sticks and external hard drives would be used today. As the latter half of the 20th century and the Cold War rolled by, more and more funding and development would be poured into what essentially became the US government and military's own private computer network, ARPANET. In 1969, attempts were made at connecting computers at various locations across the United States via ARPANET, and these attempts proved successful, with the first host-to-host connection being made between Stanford Research Institute, or SRI, and the University of California, Los Angeles, or UCLA, thus creating the very first node or network point of what would eventually become the Internet. This undertaking was facilitated by SRI programmer Bill Duval and UCLA student Charlie Klein on the 29th of October of that same year. In 1971, computer programmer Ray Tomlinson wrote the first email program for ARPANET, and those involved in the project took to it instantly. Early examples of mailing lists, which eventually became known as listservs, followed email almost immediately, creating virtual discussion groups. One of the first email discussion lists was SF Lovers, which was dedicated to science fiction fans. This would be the precursor to what eventually became forums and blog sites, and one could argue that it probably led to the creation of social media sites and apps later on down the line, and that accursed cesspool of degeneracy and heathenism known as Reddit. What ARPANET could not do was talk to any of the other computing networks that inevitably sprang up in its wake. Its design required too much control and too much standardization among machines and equipment on the network. So in the spring of 1973, computer scientists Vinton Cerf and Bob Kahn began considering ways of connecting ARPANET with two other networks that had emerged, specifically SatNet, or satellite networking, and a Hawaii-based packet radio system called AlohaNet. One day, waiting in a hotel lobby, Cerf dreamed up a new computer communications protocol, a gateway between networks, which eventually became known as Transmission Control Protocol/Internet Protocol, or TCP/IP. TCP/IP, which was first tested on ARPANET in 1977, was a one-way network that could hand off data packets to another, then another, and another, eventually being able to share out data packets with multiple networks simultaneously. Eventually, when the Internet finally evolved to consist of a network of networks, Cerf's initial innovation would prove to be quite invaluable. His ideas and implementation of TCP/IP remains the basis of the modern Internet to this very day. In 1975, ARPANET was transferred to the Defense Communications Agency. By that time, it was no longer experimental, nor was it alone. Numerous new networks had emerged by the late 1970s, including CSNet, Computer Science Research Network, CDNet, Canadian Network, BitNet because it's Time Network, and NSFNet, National Science Foundation Network. The last of these would eventually replace ARPANET as the backbone of the Internet. before it was itself superseded by commercial networks. The term Internet was adopted in 1983, at about the same time that TCP/IP came into wide use. In 1983, ARPANET was divided into two parts: MILNET, to be used by military and defense agencies, and a civilian version of ARPANET. The word Internet was initially coined as an easy way to refer to the combination of these two networks due to their internetworking. The end of ARPANET's days arrived in mid-1982, when its communications protocol NCP was turned off for a day, allowing only network sites that had switched to Vinton Cerf and Robert Kahn's TCP/IP language to communicate. On January 1st, 1983, NCP was consigned to history, and TCP/IP began its rise as the universal protocol. The final breakthrough for TCP/IP came in 1985, when it was built into a newer version of the Unix operating system, which was an early multi-user computer operating system similar to that of Linux and what would eventually become Mac OS and Microsoft Windows. As both free and commercial online services like Prodigy, FidoNet, Usenet, Gopher, and many others rose, and as NSFNet became the internet's backbone, ARPANET's importance was diminished. The system was finally shut down in 1989 and formally decommissioned in 1990, just 2 years before British-born computer scientist and entrepreneur Tim Berners-Lee would change everything all over again with the introduction of the World Wide Web in the early 90s. And as they say, dear viewers, the rest is history. Thanks to the need for superior technology during times of war, missile measuring contests between Russia and the US, and just a bunch of extremely smart super nerds, we now have the means to engage in arguments in online comment sections and download gigabytes worth of questionable, not safe for work content directly onto all our digital devices at the push of a button, as well as create surreal Lovecraftian abominations in our free time with the use of generative AI.
What the fuck?
In all seriousness though, the story of the internet is quite fascinating, and I suppose for most younger generations, it's difficult to imagine a time when this technology did not exist. While I was exposed to a computer at the age of 7 and the internet was already in existence by the mid-90s in South Africa, it wasn't until I turned 14 in the year 2005 that I would get to experience the internet with the ever so primitive use of dial-up connection, because South African service providers are always a century behind the rest of the world when it comes to telecommunications technology. But back to my experience with the internet in the middle of puberty. Boy, did I experience it.
Stop! You violated the law. Pay the court a fine or serve your sentence. Your stolen goods are now forfeit.
But anyway, the world has definitely come a long way since the 1960s regarding the questionable technology of the internet, which in my opinion is both our greatest invention as a species as well as our possible descent into chaos and madness, judging by the way things have been going in the last decade online. Anyway, that's it from me for today, dear viewers. I hope you all enjoyed the video and the totally awesome gameplay of the best game ever made that even surpasses the greatness of the internet itself.
The consequences of not saying what was true. You should be afraid of contaminating your soul with deceit. That's what you should be afraid of.
If you enjoy my content, please do consider conducting the holy subscription rituals by pressing the subscribe button, tickling the bell button for updates, liking and saying the holy incantations in the comments, and spreading my gospel to others by sharing this video. In the name of the Omnissiah. Until next time, peace.
That shit was ass.